Hey all and welcome. Recently I got hold of a Simucube 2 Pro base, so the 25 Newton meter version, which is 5 Newton meters more than I had before on my VRS direct drive wheelbase I used for the past couple years. The Simucube 2 is about 5 years old by now, so not my particular base, but when it was released. And this video is going to be somewhat of a first impression kind of review type of the base. So let's see what I found. Mounting the base was fairly easy for me because the Simucube has the bolts in the exact same place as the VRS base does. So I could really just swap it in and out, remove the VRS base. All I needed was a second pair of hands of my girlfriend to dial in the bolts while I was holding the base, and the other way around when we were tightening the Simucube Pro base onto exactly the same mount that I already had here, so this was super easy. The next thing I had to do was to get my Usher button box with a 300mm rim onto the QR. The QR itself comes with a 50mm diameter for the bolts, while the button box has 70mm. Thankfully, there's already a converter included, or adapter, whatever you want to call it. And with that, it's fairly easy to connect the two. The only issue I found was that the adapter isn't threaded, so the bolts that you put in aren't going to tighten there itself. You need nuts on the other side to keep it all in place. Not so much of an issue, just a bit fiddly, and there isn't too much space on the other side there for a wrench or something. So not ideal, but you only do this once at the beginning when you mount everything, and then you'll probably never touch it again. What you might use more often is the QR, and I guess everybody knows it by now, but still we're going to show it, is that it's fairly easy. You'll just put on the rim essentially, slide it, well, you can slide it from the bottom, I'm sliding it from the top here, and once it's in place, you just take the pin, put it in with a bit of force, and then this should be tied to the base forever. By default, the Simucube 2 Pro base also comes with the emergency button, and you also can't run the base without. So this has to be connected and put it somewhere where you can reach it, because I've seen others accidentally hit the button, and then when they wanted to use the base quickly again, they couldn't reach it. So make sure it's close to you. For safety, of course, because these things are super strong, and if the game has an issue and sends weird force feedback signals to the base, you definitely don't want to be near it if it goes mad. So just make sure you have that button there, and use it if you need to. After installing the drivers and software, doing a rudimentary setup without looking for the details, I could already run it. All I had to do was to go into all the games, go to the settings, just calibrate the base once in each game, so it's really a couple second process, and it would already work with pretty much the exact same settings that I was running on the VRS base. So the transition couldn't possibly be easier, I guess, but of course I'll play around with the settings a bit more, so let's have a look what options we really have with the base and how it feels in the end. Before I mounted the Simucube base, I made sure to do a couple more laps on the VRS just to have its feeling more present in my memory and to actually be able to tell the difference between the two. Of course, there's like half an hour between the two bases when you're mounting it, and the memory fades actually really quickly, especially because the VRS GD wasn't a bad base at all. I used it for several years, and I just wanted to make sure that if I swap to the Simucube now, I have the kind of best memory of it to compare the Simucube against to. Yeah, and then I took it for a spin. The initial run I did was just with the same settings that I had on the VRS before, so I didn't change anything in ACC, and I put the base in the Simucube driver to the same Newton meter just to be sure I have the kind of same thing. What I noticed right away was that I felt I needed a little higher Newton meters in the Simucube base to kind of get the similar feeling as on the VRS. So now I'm running it at 18 instead of the 16 Newton meters that I ran the VRS base with. But the good thing is the Simucube has even more headroom, up to 25 instead of the VRS's 20. So that of course doesn't pose any problem. And from there on, it all feels pretty similar, and the first couple corners or laps you also won't really feel the difference. It is only when you kind of get adapted to it and then some more detail perhaps is starting to present itself in the signal. And at first I wasn't quite sure if this was actually there. Maybe it was just because I was trying to be more sensitive and trying to look for more things in the force feedback, and then suddenly they were there, whereas previously might have just ignored them because they were irrelevant to the driving. But then I took a look at the data, and you really have to look really closely here because, of course, before we were looking at a direct drive base, and now we're looking at a different direct drive base that has a higher slew rate, which in theory allows the base to accelerate the wheel a little faster, produce peak forces a little faster. So let's move on to the settings. And as I said here, in the overall strength, I've set it to 18 Newton meters. I don't need this incredible range because, of course, in a GT3 that you're driving in ACC, this is not necessary. Real life, GT3 cars produce anywhere between 7 to 10 Newton meters or something. So just going to 25 all the way doesn't really make sense. You can choose anything you want at the end of the day. I settled just for something to recreate the previous strengths and feelings that I have to, for me personally, make the transition easier. So perhaps if you're coming from a VRS or potentially any other base that uses the Mish motor, you might want to kind of just increase the strength a little on the Simucube tube to kind of get into the same range there. Then the bump stop feel. That's just how the steering wheel feels when you put it at the very end of the travel, how hard it hits the wall, basically, because in theory it could turn much more. And if you do that, what you'll also notice is when you just turn the wheel, I mean, you can barely see it here, okay? But if you turn the wheel, there's just zero anything. If you don't have any friction or damping set, the thing has zero resistance. There's no little knots in there or so. It's just a perfectly smooth movement without any resistance. And I remember on the VRS, even if it was stationary, that you could feel like the thing going through the magnets, right? Just a tiny amount, not as much as on the Fanatec, for example, much more subtle already on the VRS, but on the Simucube, this is entirely gone. It just doesn't exist. That is one thing you notice, and this probably also is present then later while you're driving. But let's go through here one by one. So using the 900 degrees as before in order to be able to cover all cars in ACC without having to adjust in the driver. Next thing, we'll probably cover this setting at the end because it's one of the most, well, not interesting ones, but it has the most impact. Damping wise, I also just copy pasted essentially what I had on the VRS. So a little damping, a little friction, because especially in ACC around the center, especially with the setups we're driving with a strong negative toe on the front axle, you will have this bit of a numb feeling around just the center of the steering. And to get rid of this numb feeling in the center, it helps to just increase the resistance in the wheel a bit. And you can do this several ways, but I just use a mixture of both a little bit of friction, so that's a static force that is always going to be there, and a bit of damping, which is a force that grows the quicker you're trying to turn the wheel. So it is a difference between friction being a static value and damping being kind of adaptive to how quickly you try to turn the wheel. Just using a little bit of both, don't go too far. That's going to make the entire experience a little numb and also make the oversteer corrections less fast when you increase the friction too much. So stay low with these values. Just do enough so you get a kind of not too sensitive center or not too empty center in the steering, which is more of a force feedback issue of the game, not at all of the base. Usually not using any inertia, because this weight feeling, a term people usually use wrong. When people say they want resistance, they say weight, but weight is something very different. Weight is something that needs to be accelerated, and then it has inertia to actually stop rotating again. So it's like pushing a weight on the road, and then it's not going to stop until the friction stops it. So weight, I think, is something that feels a bit weird. Inertia is something that feels a bit weird. I'd always resort to friction and damping should you want to have a bit more fleshiness in the force feedback. Maybe that's a better term. Then static force reduction. I think some people use it. I haven't played around with it yet because everything is there. Even when the maximum force feedback in the game occurs, there's still all the details present because it's very hard to get clipping with this. And then the slew rate. If you feel the steering wheel is a bit too sharp, presents a little bit too much detail, or it rips on your hand a bit too much, maybe you want to go down with the slew rate. As a professional esports player, we want as much information as fast, as crisp, as harsh to just have that available in our hands really, really quickly to be able to make decisions based on it. So the slew rate we usually put up to the maximum, which on this base is 8 newton meters per millisecond. So it's how quickly the base is able to produce the maximum forces. And the higher you go, the quicker you'll have a strong signal at the end of the day. But we're talking milliseconds here, probably hard to feel the difference unless you go back and forth between two bases within seconds, essentially. Ultra low latency mode, something on ACC that is probably not too important because ACC sends a force feedback signal every 2.5 milliseconds. Just reducing that any further probably has very little impact, but of course we're just running these things at a maximum to get the signal from the PC the fastest into your hand. So that's what we keep doing. Anything below that is irrelevant. You usually do not ever have to touch it. So just leave that out. And now we're just going to go to the force reconstruction filter, which essentially is the interpolation. Think of it like this. iRacing has the 60 hertz signal. So you're getting a force feedback signal here. And if you're going fast enough, you're getting a force feedback signal here. And the faster the car goes, the more distance you're covering on the track without a force feedback signal. And say if you're here, you're getting a 5 newton meter signal. And if you're here, you're getting a 10 newton meter signal. And the thing is, if you go from 5 to 10 straight, then this can become a bit of a sharp and weird experience. So what is happening is that you get that 5 newton meter signal, and that 5 newton meters are slowly built up, so to say, until the next signal arrives. And the same, once the 10 newton meter signal comes, this is going to be built up through a few more signals. So everything gets filtered a bit in order to not be this sharp. This is already much better on iRacing with a 360 hertz mode that the Simucube has exclusively, but we'll speak about this well, not exclusively, there are others that have it as well now, but it does make a huge change for iRacing, but we'll speak about this in a minute. For ACC, we already have the 400 hertz of force feedback signal. So you, in theory, do not need this reconstruction filter, but I just want to show you what happens when we turn it up or when we turn it down. So here's why I decided to go with the reconstruction filter or interpolation on 8. And why they call it reconstruction filter is also because they do something different than just a regular mathematical filter. They have some prediction algorithm of what the next potential force feedback command is. So it does differ a bit from other bases, but it's, as far as I can tell, not disclosed what actually happens there. So play around with that, see if you feel anything. However, if we, and I'm starting here with this on a high value, and I try to do some audio recordings because this is the, kind of the best way to experience this. And the higher you put the value, the more silent the bass will become, because you don't have such fast and drastic changes in the command or force output that the wheel has. And the lower you put this number until you eventually turn this thing off entirely, where there is not going to be any interpolation, it just takes the command straight from the game, so to say, and that will cause a bit of noisiness. And here's the thing now where I feel the Simucube the first time felt a bit different than the VRS base before. Whenever I added filters like that, or interpolation, or changed the slew rate on the VRS, it always felt like it became number. It felt like detail disappeared and it flattened the signal yeah, just too much right away with the tiniest of filtering. And when I went here through the Simucube base and all the filtering, you can get a huge impact on the noise level that you have. And yes, you will feel the difference in the signal as well, that it's somehow not as crisp and sharp, but at the same time, it's still there. So in a very prominent way, just that it doesn't feel as edgy anymore. And that was something, and we're really talking tiny differences here, but I think this is what it's all about in the end with this bass, is that you still get the detail without it becoming too blunt, so to say. So it's all there, but not as in your face, so to say. And you know me, guys, I always try to work with data whenever it is available and show something useful. And just want to show you something here that I'm not going to take as proof because, you know, laps you drive can always differ. There's so many factors involved, but I just want to kind of highlight this, what I felt I found here, what I was just trying to describe in the feeling, where it is more crisp and smooth at the same time. And what we're comparing here is the solid line is from the Simucube, whereas the dotted line is from the VRS. And if I compare it to someone not on a direct drive base or on one that has a lot of filtering, for example, then you can kind of see the same level of differences, where my data always seems more detailed in the steering column, whereas for someone not on a direct drive base, everything is flattened a bit and there's not too much up and down in the signal. Now, if you look at the Simucube trace, the darker one, there are these things here. Like, this is the area that I found interesting at the end of the day, where a certain amplitude, a certain amount of movement is always very similar between the bases, but there are some things that I just never saw on the VRS so far. And there are just these very tiny movements here. And that is definitely too small for my hands to do. And therefore, it can only come from the force feedback one way or another. And you'll have these in various places. I just chose a random corner here to show it. This is turn 10 or 11, I believe, on Barcelona. So this is this area here, this long right-hander with a double apex, where I felt there's something happening middle of the turn, where there's a tiny bit more happening in the force feedback that I didn't quite have before in the VRS. So what we didn't cover until now was iRacing, and I will certainly make a separate video on that. I just want to give you my first impressions here. So I took it into the Formula 4 on Tsukuba. Moving on to iRacing, we have to go back to the settings here for a second. Notable changes are that we have increased the overall strength now a little, because in the Formula 4 we have a bigger bandwidth of potential forces. The peaks can be a little higher, and that would make the small forces a little more insignificant. So we're increasing the range to also keep the detail alive here. Interestingly, on iRacing, we do not now need as much of the interpolation or the force reconstruction filter, because maybe it's a 360 Hertz signal now compared to the 60 Hertz signal. There is no switch to turn this back off or on again. Ever since I got the base, it was running with 360 Hertz on iRacing. There's like just a note on the main screen of the app, but there is no on and off switch for that. So I can't really compare how it was before to after. But what there is a notable change from the VRS base that was running with 60 Hertz or using IR-FFB as a third-party app to increase the force feedback signal, while also using a VJoy device, blah, blah, blah. Lots of stuff to get around iRacing still subpar force feedback. And this is, I think, where really all the strength of the Simucube really comes into play, because iRacing does simply feel different now. iRacing has this thing, and we had it in the last video, so if you want to watch that, and on their tire model and update, and that's coming, blah, 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 I already mentioned that in iRacing, the response of the tire is kind of what defines how the car goes into the corner. And this means the first bit of steering Yeah, the first couple millimeters in the steering, they really define what is happening in the corner, where you're pointing the car, where you end up. And I felt with the 60 hertz on the VRS base, the center of steering in iRacing was always a bit numb, and it took a few millimeters until actual force feedback kicked in and gave you information whether or not you did too much, too little, oversteer, understeer, whatever. And now, with the Simucube, this center is not as numb anymore. There's resistance right from the start. Might be the 360 hertz signal now, might be whatever Simucube does with the iRacing signal themselves, but the center of steering is not as dead anymore. And this couldn't make a bigger difference than it actually does. Now I feel I can be much more precise with the steering, because the initial few degrees that are all decisive in iRacing are already giving me some feedback. I'll show a clip in a second here, but let's just go through the setting and a few things that are different as well. I decreased the friction here a tiny bit compared to ACC, but that's minor in comparison. Everything else really is the same. It's only about the reconstruction filter. The bass does not get as loud in iRacing with a lower value, perhaps because there's internal filtering in iRacing already, or whatever else the bass is doing. So let's get to some footage. For me, whenever I step into iRacing, the problem normally is, coming from ACC, is that I can't just adapt that quickly. I can't sign up to a race and immediately perform. I always need some warming up on the game to kind of refresh the memory as to what the game wants you to drive, because it's not as apparent from the force feedback or the visual. It's just so different at the end of the day. And I felt now that I did this test, it felt much more natural to get into iRacing as well. It can't kind of change the physics that iRacing has. It can't change the braking sensitivity that iRacing has and the weird way it rotates or doesn't. But what it does is that it gives you more of a clue when a certain thing happens. For example, now the center of the steering, as I said, is not as dull anymore, and I feel already a tiny bit of steering input having an impact on the force feedback and giving me immediately information of what the car is doing. It also makes it easier to be more precise because the center can't be moved as quickly as on the VRS, for example. Additionally, also under braking, I feel like I could dial the brake bias back more now, because I get a sense of the rear end of the car a tiny bit quicker, so I can drive the brakes more aggressively, have the steering kind of neutralizes itself from the kind of stepping out rear a little earlier than it was on the rear S. I feel there are just a few milliseconds probably in the end that make all the difference, where the information is now more present and maybe even there a tiny bit faster, which allows me to simply push a tiny bit more on the brake, and all that combined simply makes the game a tiny bit less alien and at the end of the day easier to drive, full stop. Let's do a bit of a summary then. If you are on ACC and you already had a direct drive, then you already had 400 Hz force feedback, because ACC's force feedback to me always has plenty of information. An issue that ACC currently has is that the center of steering is a bit dull and dead, and the car is not really responsive in this area, and therefore also the force feedback feels a bit dull in this area. You can tackle this with any base, but also in the Simucube base with a bit of damping, a bit of friction to make the center of the steering less vague, so to say, but there isn't actually more information in that scenario. However, we found with a bit of hints in the data that there is, or there might be indeed, a little more detail retained in the corners over certain bumps. Need to confirm in an in-depth look later on, but it looked like there was an actual difference. And also make sure you can actually crank up the interpolation in the Simucube software a little to make the bass more silent, make the force feedback signal more smooth, but at the same time retain a bit of detail, and that was something I was missing on the VRS. Every time I made it more smooth, I lost detail, and that does not seem to be the case here on the Simucube. But the main game changer really comes on iRacing for me. Previously, I had to run with a 60 Hz on the VRS base, or use the IRFFB app, which brought some delay into the entire chain of the command being produced by the game to coming into the base at the end of the day. We're talking something like 10 to 15 milliseconds, which with a edgy to drive car can make quite the difference. The 360 Hz mode is on by default, so I couldn't try the Simucube base without, but it did already feel like a massive change. We did not need much of the interpolation filtering because somehow either the base already does that or iRacing does a little bit by default. The main thing I think comes in where the center of the steering has more resistance now, which the VRS didn't have. The Simucube does have that. This is important because in iRacing, the center of steering is super sensitive because the cars are so responsive, and you need to be super precise with the first tiny bit of steering input that you have. And just straight facts, the Simucube base compared to my VRS is helping massively with being more precise, doing more subtle inputs around the center of steering, and therefore you will be much more confident, or at least I felt more confident and better equipped going into the turns. On the VRS base, it was always a bit like I would turn in and then it would take a fraction of time until I got feedback about the tire load building, and more often than not, this would already be too much or too little, and then from there on you are always on the back foot. Now this is much more immediate with the Simucube base, and therefore this is better. Same or similar experience I also had when doing the trail braking. I could just be more confident with locking the rear steer a little, going into the slip of the rear under braking, so I could perhaps dial the brake bias a tiny bit more backwards because now the information is more present in the steering wheel, perhaps even a tiny bit earlier. So first impression is on ACC at least equally as good as the VRS, perhaps a tiny bit better, as we could already see in the data, and maybe with a smoothness and retained detail. But on iRacing, I'll do more testing. There will be a dedicated video with the SC2 on iRacing, as there will be a dedicated video of the active pedal on all games. You can find my profiles already in the TrueDrive software. And I think this was a really first promising impression. We'll go into more detail in the future. So thank you all for watching. Make sure to make use of the Black Week, of all the feelings that I have. Simucube has the pedal on offer for a couple days, as much as they have in stock. And in case you are looking for something else, make sure to check the Discord or just go to Case King to find your deal of the week. And until very soon, bye.